data that is relevant to displacement risks. For example, poverty levels, housing conditions, and rent change. The Displacement Risk Index will be a snapshot of current conditions. It isn't a tool for predicting changes in a neighborhood or outcomes of any given proposal. We expect a wide variety of New Yorkers will use the data tool, such as advocacy groups, community boards, elected officials, and policymakers. Share your ideas about how this in-development resource can be shaped and improved to help advance collective discussions around racial equity and access to affordable and quality housing. Give your feedback online, by email, or at upcoming public information sessions and hearings. Get all the details and learn more about the data tool at bit.ly/equitable data tool.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Justin Lamorella from the Department of City Planning, and I'm joined today by several colleagues from the Department of City Planning and Department of Housing Preservation and Development. From the Department of City Planning, I'm joined by Lara Marita, the Director of Neighborhood Studies at DCP, Sreet Plotkin from the Queen's Office, and Erica Maurer from the Population Division. From the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, we are joined by Renee Widdison and Chris Servideo from the Office of Neighborhood Strategies. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. We will start with a presentation and then dedicate the rest of the meeting to answering as many questions as possible. During the presentation, if a question comes to mind, you can submit it by using the Q&A feature. Staff will collect the questions and queue them up for the live Q&A session. Once we start the live Q&A portion of the event, you will then have two options to ask a question. You can continue to submit written questions via the Q&A feature, or you can raise your hand to speak verbally. If you are phoning in, press *9 to raise your hand. When your name is called, you will be able to use the buttons at the bottom left corner of your Zoom screen to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you like. We will alternate between written questions and those who want to ask a question verbally. And don't worry, I'll go over these instructions again after the presentation. Next slide, please. After the presentation, the chat feature will also be enabled so that you can interact with one another. And again, if you want to ask us a question, please put it in the Q&A box instead of the chat. In addition, should you have any technical issues, call the hotline number on the screen. The number is 877-853-5247 and enter the meeting ID 618-237-7396. And the password is #. And someone will be able to assist you. This technical hotline info can be found at the bottom of every slide in case you need assistance. In addition to American Sign Language interpretation that you see on the screen, we will also be offering simultaneous interpretation today in Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. To access these services, click the interpretation button on the bottom of the screen. Select the Spanish channel for Spanish, the Chinese channel for Mandarin, and the Portuguese channel for Cantonese.
Además de la interpretación del lenguaje de señas americano en la pantalla, también ofrecemos interpretación simultánea en español, mandarín y cantonés. Para acceder a estos servicios, haga clic en el botón de idioma en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Seleccione el canal español para español, el canal chino para mandarín y el canal cantonés para cantonés.
Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Sarit Plakin to start the presentation.
Good morning. I'm Sarit Platkin from the Department of City Planning, and on behalf of the interagency team, I'm excited for you all to join today for the first Equitable Development Data Tool info session. Today, we are going to provide background on this new resource and the initiative that it stems from, as well as do a demonstration of the draft tool and provide information about next steps and how to provide input during the draft phase that we're in right now. And then we'll answer any questions. So we are at a critical stage in the process right now, having released a draft version of the website on January 25th and a draft version of the Displacement Risk Index on February 18th. And we're moving towards an April 1st launch of the fully functional data tool. In this draft phase, we want to make sure that we're hearing from a broad range of New Yorkers about how you want to use the tool, how it relates to conversations you're having in your communities, and whether the tool as it's currently designed would meet your needs. The public hearing for this initiative will be held on March 10th, and we're holding these sessions in advance to ensure that New Yorkers are equipped to participate in the public hearing. And another thing that we want to highlight is that this is really the beginning of the opportunities to learn about and weigh in on the tool. In addition to the upcoming public hearing, we'll be providing trainings for community boards and the public once the site is launched in April. And we look forward to ongoing conversations and feedback after the April launch as well. The tool is going to continue to evolve after the launch as we see how it's being used in practice and how it can be improved. So with that, we look forward to sharing the draft of this resource with you today, and we'll be happy to answer any questions and hear your initial feedback. So the Equitable Development Data Tool is going to be an interactive online public data tool that will allow New Yorkers to explore data about housing conditions, demographics, quality of life, and more at the neighborhood, borough, and citywide levels. This new resource will provide New Yorkers with easy access to a wide range of data about their neighborhoods and city to help facilitate challenging conversations about housing affordability, racial equity, displacement, and other key planning issues. Whenever possible, the data will be broken down by race and ethnicity at the neighborhood level so that New Yorkers can learn about disparities across neighborhoods and demographic groups. And the data is also going to show change over time over the last 20 years so that New Yorkers can see the shifting demographic and housing patterns in the city. So how did this tool originate? The creation of the Equitable Development Data Tool is a requirement of Local Law 78 that was passed in June of 2021. And the legislation developed out of ongoing advocacy by the Racial Impact Study Coalition and public advocate Jumaane Williams to ensure that racial equity is centered in major decisions affecting New Yorkers and New York City neighborhoods, such as land use. Local Law 78 of 2021 includes two major components: the Equitable Development Data Tool and the Racial Equity Reports. The Equitable Development Data Tool, as mentioned up front, will be an interactive tool that will have a wide variety of data broken down by race and ethnicity available at the neighborhood up through the citywide scales. A key piece of that tool is, as required by the legislation, is a displacement risk index. The displacement risk index is going to be a map of the city that illustrates the level of risk in different neighborhoods that residents face of being displaced or unable to remain in their homes or neighborhoods. The Equitable Development Data Tool is required to be complete by April 1st, and we're currently in the draft phase of the tool with the opportunity to provide input on it through March 20th. The second major component of the legislation, the racial equity reports on housing and opportunity, are going to be disclosure reports required for certain land use applications beginning in June of 2022. These reports will inform the land use process by providing context to support discussions of race and equity in planning. And we'll be providing more details on all of these components throughout the presentation today. So now that we've talked a bit about what is required by the legislation, I also want to talk about the benefits that we see this tool providing in practice. So having a tool that provides easily accessible neighborhood and demographic data broken down by race will bring racial equity considerations into the forefront of planning conversations in New York City. And given the potential for this new resource to inform everything from site-specific to neighborhood-wide to citywide planning efforts, we really anticipate that this tool could be used by a wide variety of stakeholders. Community boards may use it in reviewing land use proposals and preparing district needs statements. Advocacy and nonprofit organizations may find it helpful while doing research about citywide housing and demographic trends. And community members leading conversations about neighborhood planning and change may use this data to help advocate for their planning priorities. And with that, I'll note that above all, as an interagency team, we really see this new tool as a shared resource between planners and community members that can provide a new way of talking and engaging about displacement pressures and neighborhood change that will hopefully allow for more common ground and facilitate planning policies that explicitly consider race. Altogether, these objectives aim to support more equitable development long-term. So now that we've done a bit of the background, we're going to shift to a demonstration of the website and the draft materials that are available for review right now. Okay. So here we are. This is the site. You can navigate it either by scrolling down or using this top navigation bar. I think we'll also be adding links to the site in the chat just so that you have that. Right below the video, the first thing you see is a welcome section that provides background on what we're building, the legislation, who's involved, and what's up for review right now. And that's actually the first thing that I want to talk about with you all here. So let's scroll to that. So the 4 things available for review right now are interactive mockups of what the future data tool is going to look like, the displacement risk index or map of the city illustrating the level of displacement risk in different neighborhoods compared to each other, the data dictionary describing the data points and methodologies of the tool, and a bibliography of the literature that informed the data points and methodologies. Next up is the project timeline. We've already talked a little bit about this, but this just goes through what was released when, the draft materials and the displacement risk index being released in the last several weeks over the last month. Next up are all of the different ways to engage in the timeline, the info sessions that you all are a part of now, the public hearing coming up next week on March 10th at 4 p.m., and then future milestones. So the full site is going to be launching on April 1st, and the racial equity reports, which we're going to discuss a little bit more later, the requirement for those is going to go into effect on June 1st. And then below that, we have links to or ways to participate and provide input during this draft phase. So there are information about the info sessions, office hours, which are going to be coming up next week. If you are interested in a one-on-one chat with the project team developing the tool, you can of course provide testimony at the public hearing next week, and we encourage you to do so. And then you can also email the team at this email here, and we'll have all this information at the end too, and share information directly on the site by March 20th. So below that, we have the data tool. So you can see here that there are 5 major components of the tool or categories within the data tool. And then below that, the exciting part, the interactive mockups of what the data tool will look like. You can look at these 2 ways. You can either look at standalone images of the mockups below, or you can click up here where it says illustrative interactive mockups, and you can go from there into looking at the mockups themselves. So let's shift into that now. And there also should be links to the mockups in the chat so that you can follow along with me as I'm doing this. It's going to be a lot of information, and I want to make sure you can dive into this more on your own. Also, we can pull this back up and answer any questions during the Q&A. So let's get started. So this is the landing page for the data tool, where you'll have the option of selecting between 3 levels of geography. So as you can see here, you can toggle between community district, borough, or citywide. And kind of going back to community district, what you can do there, what you can do there is actually select the Sunnyside and Woodside neighborhood, which is right now the only neighborhood that is selectable in this draft version of the data tool. So when you select on that neighborhood, you can click the View Data button, which brings you to a screen that shows you the data tables. Now, before diving into the tables, I do want to highlight that these are just mockups, so the tables aren't populated with actual data yet. But once the tool formally launches in April, it will, of course, have data in it. And this is really for demonstration purposes to give you a sense of what the tool is going to look and feel like. So when you get to the screen of the data tables, you will see the different categories on the left. So you'll see demographic conditions, household economic security. You can click and toggle between these different categories like housing production and household economic security. We're actually going to kick it off with demographic conditions and look at one of the initial data points there to start. So with demographic conditions, you can see that Okay, so with demographic conditions, you can see that the first data point is mutually exclusive race and Hispanic origin. You can scroll down to see more data points that are within the demographic category, like foreign-born population, limited English-speaking population, and these are all data points required by the legislation. Then if you scroll to the right, you can see how these data points change over time from the year 2000 to 2020 and see what that comparison looks like. At the top of the table, you can see the data source. So in this case, it's the census. And then if you look at the very top up here, you can see that you can look at these data points broken down by racial and ethnic groups. So right now we're looking at total population, but if we want to take a look at the different racial and ethnic groups, we can scroll to this arrow down in the bottom left, which minimizes the screen on the left and brings us to this new screen where we can click back and forth between the different racial and ethnic groups within the Sunnyside and Woodside neighborhood. Or we can go back to total population. And you can repeat that for the different categories like household economic security and housing production. You can take a look at the different racial and ethnic groups there. So a couple other things that I do want to point out about the data tables before we wrap up this demo is that at the top right, there is a download button that allows you to download all of the data in these data tables. Another feature that I want to highlight is the data reliability button here on the right. So this tool has, implemented a data reliability threshold based on the department standards. But if you'd like to see the reliability data, you can click that button just under the download button, and it'll show you the margin of error and coefficient of variation for the data for more information on that topic. So this actually wraps up our demo. And, as we segue to other components of the initiative, I do want to note that an important use of the data tool, in addition to being, available to the public, is that it will provide data for the racial equity reports that are going to be required for certain land use applications. So with that, let's take a look at a little bit more information about what's included in the racial equity reports. So Local Law 78 requires certain applications or certain applicants participating in the city's land use review process, known as ULURP, to submit racial equity reports beginning in June of 2022. And these reports are going to provide context for the discussion of racial equity in the review of land use applications. Generally speaking, the reports are going to be required for projects that include residential development over 50,000 square feet or 50 units of housing, and non-residential development over 200,000 square feet, as well as other more specific cases. The racial equity reports are going to have three main components. The first is a community profile of data pulled from the data tool that we just took a look at. The second is project-specific data about proposed housing units and anticipated jobs in the project. And the third is a narrative statement of how the project relates to the city's goals to further fair housing and equitable access to opportunity. And I'll also note that the interagency team advancing this project is currently developing guidance for this report as a next step. And we'll be offering trainings to stakeholders in the spring about the reports, what's going to be included in them, and how to review them. And thank you all. I will now be turning it over to Renee to talk about the Displacement Risk Index.
Thank you, Sarit. Morning, everybody. So I will be talking about the Displacement Risk Index. So to start with, the Displacement Risk Index is a component of the larger tool that Sarit just walked us through. It's a new citywide analysis, and it incorporates risk factors that may contribute to displacement. It's a composite indicator, which means that unlike the data tool that Sarit showed you, where we will see individual data points pulled from the census, for example, this index combines a number of indicators. It's important to note that the index is based on recent conditions and trends based on data availability. What will the Displacement Risk Index do? So as Sarit spoke about earlier with the overall tool, the Displacement Risk Index is a kind of critical piece of the larger mission. So as a component of the data tool, the Displacement Risk Index will be public, and communities and stakeholders can use it in a variety of ways. But the index will also be used to inform the development of strategies to prevent displacement. It will also provide context for the consideration of policies and projects. And it's important to note that the index isn't predictive. It's not able to tell us the future or predict outcomes from specific neighborhood or development proposals. But it can provide important common ground, as Sarit mentioned, for conversations about housing and neighborhood stability. So I mentioned that the index incorporates risk factors. Well, what are risk factors for displacement? We know that there are three major categories of factors that contribute to risk of displacement. The first we call population vulnerability. These are characteristics of a household that make them more or less at risk of being forced to move. Like, for example, how much of your income you spend on rent, which is called rent burden. The second category of risk factors are housing conditions. or characteristics of the housing itself that contribute to housing instability, like whether or not your rent is stabilized. The last category is market pressure. These are neighborhood forces that can make it harder for a household to stay in their home, such as housing price changes. So I'm going to walk you through more detail about these factors, and everything I'm about to show you is also available on the website for you to explore. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, we know this is a lot of information, please add them to the Q&A chat. So you can see here that I'm back on that website that Sarit was showing you earlier. If you look at the top, I'm under the section called Displacement Risk Index. And I've scrolled down to this map titled Population Vulnerability. You'll recall this term from the last slide I showed about the 3 risk categories. On the left, you can see the details of the map that we're looking at. So we're looking at the population vulnerability category, and it's composed of 4 data points: race, income, limited English proficiency, and rent burden. So on the right is a map showing the degree of population vulnerability across the city. Darker blue color represents neighborhoods with more population risk factors relative to the rest of the city. And the lighter areas show neighborhoods with fewer or less intense risk factors than other neighborhoods in the city. Now, why did we choose these 4 indicators? Well, we know from both research and experience that these factors influence a household's housing stability. For example, let's look at rent burden. So this map shows the share of households in a neighborhood that are spending 50% of their income or more on rent. We call that severe rent burden when a household is spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And as I'm sure you can all appreciate, when that's the case, it becomes very difficult for a household to afford even modest increases in rent. So if a neighborhood has more households in this situation, it is a more at-risk neighborhood. Now, because of data limitations, this particular map is showing neighborhood rates of severe rent burden as compared to the citywide average. In other words, there's a certain percentage of all New York households that are severely rent burdened. And this map is showing which neighborhoods have about the same rate of severe rent burden as the city. Those are shown in gray. It's also showing neighborhoods that have a lower rate of severe rent burden in light blue, and the neighborhoods that have a higher rate of severe rent burden than the city as a whole are shown in dark blue. So this is just one of the 4 population vulnerability indicators. Just wanted to show you this one as an example. So now let's look at the housing conditions category. So as a reminder, here we're looking at combined characteristics of a neighborhood's housing rather than its households. So the 4 housing conditions data points are rental units, so whether you rent or own your home, housing that is not income restricted or rent stabilized, and housing that has a lot of maintenance deficiencies. So we included these factors because, again, based on both research and experience, we know that these factors can impact displacement risk. For example, rental housing is less stable because there are more ways a household can be pushed out relative to an owner-occupied housing unit. And housing that is poorly maintained is also less stable because it may be legally unsafe to live in, or it could be a sign of landlord harassment. So this map is showing the combined effect of these 4 data points for each neighborhood. And similar to the last map, the darkest green neighborhoods are those with the least stable housing conditions, and the lightest green are the most stable housing conditions. So let's look at an example of one of these 4 indicators. So as you can see on the left, this map shows that we're looking at the percent of a neighborhood's housing that is rented. And you can look at the legend and see that this map is showing, the darkest green neighborhoods are places where over 85% of all the housing units are rented. And in the lightest green are neighborhoods where under about 40% of housing units are rented, meaning that over 50% are owned. Now we'll look at the last risk category up for displacement, market pressure. So just like population vulnerability and housing conditions, we have made this market pressure category with 4 data points. So again, market pressure is looking at neighborhood forces that influence the housing market and increase risk of displacement. The indicators are change in median rent, housing price appreciation, which we'll talk about in a second, change in the population with a college degree, and proximity to a neighborhood experiencing a lot of market pressure. And again, like the last examples, the map on the right is showing you the combination of these 4 factors for every neighborhood in the city. And neighborhoods with the darker color have higher market pressure relative to the rest of the city. Everything is, relative. And the lighter colored areas have relatively lower market pressure. So let's look at one of these 4 indicators. We'll look at housing price appreciation. So this might sound complex, but essentially we're talking about how fast housing prices are going up. So this map is showing how fast the residential sale prices, the sale price for residential properties, increased in New York City between 2000 and 2020. So we know that it's harder for households to weather more extreme increases in housing prices. Generally, prices go up a little bit every year and people can generally manage that. But when there's extreme change in housing prices, that can be
Renee, could we pause for a moment? We're having a minor technical difficulty.
Absolutely.
Renee, could you try turning on your camera? Perfect. Thank you very much. Please continue.
Okay, so as I was saying, it's hard for households to weather very extreme changes in housing prices, which is why we wanted to look at how neighborhoods compare in the increase in housing prices between 2000 and 2020. So to account for very different starting prices in the year 2000, we know not all homes cost the same amount. This price is showing an indexed value, which is why you don't see any dollar signs in the legend. But to help you understand what it's telling you, homes in a neighborhood with a score of about 3 in this index about tripled in price since 2000, or neighborhoods with a appreciation of about 2 doubled in price since the year 2000. So the darker colors show areas with faster price increases or greater price increases since 2000. And the lighter color is showing smaller price increases since 2000. And just to note, it's not showing that prices in the darker areas are necessarily higher than in the lighter colored areas. It's showing that the change since 2000 is much greater. So let's take it back to the beginning. We started here with what is the displacement risk index, and hopefully this all makes a little more sense now. So the displacement risk index is incorporating factors that may contribute to displacement. We talked about a couple of those factors. It's a composite indicator Again, we're combining those factors into a single overall value, and it's based on recent trends and conditions. So as I mentioned, the DRI, or the Displacement Risk Index, is a component of the overall data tool that Sarit walked you through. So we're now back on the website that Sarit was walking us through, and you can see what I mean. So Sarit was showing you the data tool, and you can see that the data tool button is highlighted. But if you clicked on the Displacement Risk Index button, it would toggle you to this map, which is showing our draft Displacement Risk Index. So again, this map is now combining all those risk factors that we talked about a few minutes ago. It's combining population risk factors, housing risk factors, and the market pressures into a single index value. And like all the other maps, the darker color represents more risk relative to other New York City neighborhoods, and the lighter color represents lower risk relative to other New York City neighborhoods. So Sarit showed you this timeline. I just want to briefly review that we put all these materials online in the last month and a half or so, and there will be a public hearing on March 10th. We hope you all attend or submit your comments. And this is all in advance of our April 1st launch. And don't worry, if this was all very confusing, we'll be back to do more trainings with community boards and the public in April on how to use all these resources. So at this point, I imagine you might have a few questions or comments. Before we get into the Q&A, I just want to remind you all the ways that you can share your input. So if you have specific comments, you can provide testimony at the public hearing on March 10th. You can register to speak through the link that will be in the chat. If you have specific comments, you can also email the email address that's shown on the screen. It's also available on the website. You can also leave a question directly through the website. We ask that you leave those comments by March 20th. And if you want to get into the weeds on all of this or have a more one-on-one walkthrough, we would encourage you to sign up for a one-on-one chat with someone from the project team. As Sarit mentioned, we'll be holding some office hours next Monday evening. So with that, I will turn it back over to Justin.
Thank you, Sarit and Renee. We're now going to start the live Q&A portion. And just a reminder, there are two ways that you can ask questions. You can continue to submit written questions via the Q&A feature, or you can raise your hand to speak verbally. And if you are phoning in, you can press *9 to raise your hand. If you raise your hand and your name is called, you will be promoted to a panelist and your Zoom will close and reopen. But don't worry, this will just take a moment and you'll be able to speak once it reopens. And once you are a panelist, you'll be able to use the buttons at the bottom left corner of your Zoom screen to unmute yourself and turn on your video if you'd like. I will alternate between written questions and those who want to ask a question verbally. So let's get started. I'm going to start actually with some written questions that have already been entered into the Q&A feature. And my first question is, what is the reason Geography 2010 neighborhood tabulation area is used when the 2020 is available? And a technical answer is okay.
Sure. So we're in a bit of a transition phase with the geographies coming from the Census Bureau. They released late last year the updated census tract boundaries, which we use to build our neighborhood tabulation areas. The PUMA boundaries have not been released yet. They won't be released until later this year, with the data in the PUMA boundaries following that. Because the DRI has a mix of PUMA and NTA variables, we are keeping things consistent for now in the 2010 geographies. As soon as we can update things to the 2020 geographies, we will. And the same holds true for the tool where our variables and indicators are in the PUMA geographies. And so for now, everything has to be shown in the 2010 boundaries.
Great, thank you, Erica. Next question is about market pressure. It seems to be determined at the community district level, not the NTAs as it appears via lines. And why is that?
So there's a few variables, indicators that are in the DRI that are actually only available at the PUMA or approximations of community district level. And so for those, we had to use the PUMA boundaries rather than the NTA. And we're handling it a little differently than we are the NTA variables, where we're using the PUMAs to approximate the NTA. So we're using them to use the same value on the NTAs that are within the PUMAs. But because they're only available at the PUMA level, we had to represent it that way.
Thank you. And then the next question is, was any consideration given to displacement due to climate change?
I can take that one too. There's currently no indicators in the DRI or the tool that are directly related to climate change. For this initial release, we've focused on the variables that are required by the legislation, and we will continue to look into future improvements in the data that we're using in the tool.
I'll also just quickly note that we are in a draft phase of this effort. So we really encourage those comments and feedback. If you have recommendations for specific indicators that should be included, as much sort of detailed information and recommendations as you can provide is really appreciated. We have mostly tried to follow the legislation, which asked us to look at population vulnerability, housing conditions, and neighborhood change. I can see how climate change might be incorporated into those categories, but we didn't add it, but very open to suggestions.
It doesn't look like anyone has their hand raised, but as a reminder, feel free to do so if you want to ask a question verbally. But I'll continue with the written questions. How hard will it be to update the data tool, and how often will it be updated?
Our plan is to update the tool annually. That'll be based on the release of each of the different data sets that are going into the tool. And how hard it'll be, it depends on our pipeline of receiving the data and how often it's released and getting it into the tool.
Next question is, how much weight will the racial equity report be given in the EULA process so it does not become a pro forma document that is largely ignored?
I can take that question, sorry. Or if Ryan, if you wanted to weigh in on that as well.
Go ahead. I can add in and put up my thoughts on it too.
We definitely see this racial equity reporting as something that will be critical in the conversations that we have with communities and through the process of development. It is a standalone document, but will certainly be a way to continue conversations about racial equity and displacement.
That's right. And I will say that our commissioners are interested in this tool and this a new resource for them, and we are anticipating discussing this with them at certification and at points throughout the process. So in the public process, it will be, discussed and presented.
Yeah. So it looks like we have someone with their hand raised. Tiffany Khan, if you'd like to speak.
Morning. Thank you so much for this presentation. One of the concerns that I have is about undocumented immigrants, or people whose immigration status is up in the air, I prefer to say. How do you, so if you could just talk a little bit about the extent to which you've captured those people in this tool, I'd love to hear about that.
So the data that we're using is our public data sources, and they're the ones that we're using that would be related to immigration status are a survey that are self-responded. So if a person responds to the survey, they would be incorporated into our data. If they choose not to respond to the American Community Survey, we don't necessarily have that, individual counted, but there, as it is a survey, it's a sample of the people in the in each of the areas. So we'd get an idea of who's living in each of the neighborhoods and each of the PUMAs or community districts, but we don't necessarily know how many of the undocumented immigrants we are necessarily capturing in the data or incorporating in the data.
I don't mean to belabor the point, but I'm concerned about that because I personally know of neighbors, especially in West Harlem and all over in some of the areas that you've identified, who are, for example, DACA recipients, or who have even worse immigration. I'm sorry, I have a toddler who's just very annoying right now. And so is there a way that you could perhaps, if someone, so there's a mistrust that people have whenever there's anyone, for example, from the government, even if they don't understand that this is something that's beneficial to them. I don't, like, if you could talk a little bit about this how you conveyed the message to them that this was, how this would help them, or if someone just outright refused, maybe it's, I don't know, I'm sorry if this is not a very well thought out question, but that might be an indicator that that person might have an immigration status that's not, it's not at the where they would like for it to be. Perhaps that could be incorporated. I don't know. I know that doesn't give a definitive answer, but you could indicate that somewhere in the tool that this is potentially someone who's at risk, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really, hi, I'm Lara Marita. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself the last time I spoke. I think that's a very important point that you raise, and we will definitely see if there's ways that we can incorporate that into the language and work with our Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to make sure our messaging about this tool and the relevancy of it is spread around the different communities within New York City.
Great, thank you. It would be helpful also just to go to organizations that people trust.
Yeah,
like the Legal Aid Society or other organizations that people are familiar with, because someone just knocking on someone's door could be anyone.
absolutely, completely agree with you, and we'll definitely work to get that list of local providers and organizations to make sure this tool is utilized by as many people as possible.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany. The next speaker is Barbara Blair. And just as a reminder to everyone, I know that the raise hand function wasn't working earlier, but it should be working for everyone now, so feel free to utilize it.
Good morning, I'm Barbara Blair. I work in the Garment District Alliance. And my question really is speaking to one of the objectives of this report, which is fairness of the city and quality of life. And my question is there an opportunity for some sort of overlay that shows where you have clustering of social services, which neighborhoods they're in the city? And I mean the whole 5 boroughs, because there are neighborhoods in the city where you have a oversaturation of social services, whether it's supportive housing, drug addiction mitigation facilities, and those kinds of things. And it does have a profound impact on the quality of life of residents in that neighborhood, but also in the central business district as a whole. And so one of the things that we're interested in is ensuring that every single neighborhood takes their fair share of facilities that treat individuals that are handicapped in one way or another, so including supportive housing and shelters, and also that you don't end up with neighborhoods that have an oversaturation, maybe because of the historical designation of that neighborhood, or simply for racial reasons, if we look historically.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, I think that the best way I can respond to that point relative to the tool that we're working on, and you mentioned the reports, the racial equity reports do include a component, a narrative statement, where the applicant talks about how their project relates to the city's goals and strategies to affirmatively further fair housing and increase access to opportunity, equitable access to opportunity. And those currently are in the city's fair housing plan called Where We Live. And I would recommend that you take a look at that plan. And there is a lot in there about how we can think about equitably investing in neighborhoods. So while that's not, social services aren't necessarily a component of the tool right now, there will be incorporated into the reports references to our goals to sort of equally and equitably develop across the city.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Our next question comes from the Q&A chat. If 67% of New Yorkers live in rental units, which is a Furman Center 2017 statistic, is it realistic to consider rentals a negative housing condition?
Yeah, I guess I would just quickly say we do not consider renting a negative housing condition. Very pro-housing over here, pro-rental housing over here at HPD. All we're trying to say in the displacement risk index is that compared to owner-occupied housing, renters have fewer sort of protections and tend to be less stable because there are more opportunities for them to be displaced, or rents get raised, or owner decides to sell the building. There's less control over that person's housing. Obviously that varies widely across the renting population, but we're just trying to capture the concept of instability, not negativity.
All the questions we have for now. Looks like we're caught up. Pause for a second if anyone wants to raise their hand or put another question in the Q&A chat. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining today. Want to again, ask that you take a look at the website, explore the tool. Feel free to send us an email or send comments via the website, and of course attend the public hearing on March 10th as well. Again, from DCP and HPD, want to thank you all, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Also, we'll be having more info sessions if you are interested in attending the other ones, if you have other questions that come up. We'll have one Thursday and we'll have another one on Saturday.
Yes, and office hours on Monday if you want more of a one-on-one conversation with the project team. Yeah, I think we're actually going to keep the meeting open for a while. Never mind. I take that back. Thank you all so much.